Okay. Hi, Dominique.
Hello, Jan. How are you doing?
Very well, and yourself?
Good, thanks. Good. Good.
Just as a little bit of background, maybe Paul will talk about it, but Paul Haslam did a huge job. He entered into a database data on all conflicts in Latin America that he could lay his hands on, and I think he had about 677 or something like that entries, and he must have been busy with that for God knows how long, must have been. And then he analyzed all that, and he will probably be talking about what the results of the analysis were.
No, that's great. Yeah. No, I've read some of his papers. I think it's really good work, very methodical and
very thorough.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that'll be interesting. So hopefully he'll connect.
I will try to call him.
Sure.
Hello?
Hello, Paul. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I was using the other link.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Edith, Edith, are you there?
Yes, I just came back. I was calling you, Mr. Haslam. So great, you're there. And I knew you knew it because you sent me your presentation this morning. So we should be fine. So we will start the presentation. You have to know, so my name is Edith Garneau, and I'm the chairperson for the Environmental and Social Responsibility Society. And we are recording this session right now. And just to make sure that everyone knows a bit how we are going to work, Dr. Haslam will have a presentation for about, let's say, 20-30 minutes. And he can also take questions during his presentation. But I would propose that you all put your name on the chat and say that you have a question, or ask even your question on chat. Then we can have a better control and we can manage a better the timing for answering the questions from Dr. Haslam. And of course, we will have a discussion period after the presentation from Dr. Haslam. So please, I will leave. I don't need to introduce Mr. Haslam since it was in the newsletter. But we are very great to have it, and we also very great for the work done by Andrés Recalde, the lead of the working group of ESRS on conflict in Latin America, to organize that session, that webinar. So for now, I'll leave the floor to Dr. Haslam, and I will make sure to share your presentation in a few seconds. And here it is. Andrés, do you have anything to say before Mr. Haslam start the presentation?
If everything is fine.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you Thank you very much for taking time out of your day to hear a little bit about my research. And thanks to Edith and Andres for organizing this. Okay, to begin with, I just want to talk a little bit about our research on the causes of social conflict and the what we know about Canadian mining firms and the causes of social conflict. What I think we've done that is a little bit different from what other researchers have done is that we've tried to do a largely quantitative study, so a study that uses as many, you might say, objective indicators as possible. So as all of you are undoubtedly aware, there's been, over the last 15 years, a boom in commodity prices that's contributed to rapid growth of mining activity in Latin America and also worldwide in the mid-2000s. Much of this new mining activity has occurred outside of historic mining zones, and in that sense has brought rural communities, agricultural communities into contact with industrial mining for the first time for those communities. And civil society organizations and academics have, since really the early 2000s, have drawn attention to the emergence of social conflicts between mining companies and nearby communities, sometimes associating those conflicts with human rights violations as well. So in Canada, of course, the question of what are Canadian mining firms doing has become politically salient, beginning with the National Roundtables process that was started in 2006 and issued a report in 2007, and culminating more recently with the appointment of the Canadian Ombudsman for Responsible Enterprise in April. So in terms of the research question, what we're interested in is the connection between mining and social conflict. Edith, can you change the slide, please? Between mining and social conflict, our intent is to move beyond single case studies that have characterized the literature and to move forward with greater methodological rigor. So our main questions are: what factors contribute to the emergence of social conflict between a mining company and a nearby community? What role does the nationality of the firm play in social conflict? And in particular, how to characterize Canadian firms and social conflict. So this is based on well, we now have a number of publications that have come out of this research. I've listed them below in case you're interested in following up. And of course, I can arrange via Edith or Andres to send you those if you don't have direct access to those journals. So as I mentioned, what I think we've done that is kind of unique here is that we've really moved beyond the single case study, which really is the way in which much of the literature has moved forward in the last 15 years or so. And what we've tried to do is bring together really new combinations of data that you might say are sort of available as big data these days. So firstly, we began with firm level data on mining companies, or more accurately, mining properties. And we created, well, we bought actually a list of over 700 geolocated properties at advanced exploration phase and above from the industry site Infomine. So this yielded a lot of interesting variables like the ownership of the firm, we added market cap, the minerals being produced, the reserves, the exploitation method, the GIS location, although we had to verify that, and altitude. And then we used geographic information system techniques to essentially extract neighborhood data, what we call neighborhood data. That's to say we drew a buffer around each of these mining properties and used various GIS layers to extract certain information that's been gathered from remote sensing from satellites. So for example, you can get a population density, you can get the intent, how intensively the land is cultivated, you can get the presence of surface water, you can get the rainfall, the presence of parkland, and also altitude. We also linked this with census data from the third administrative level. So that's one below what we would call province, which provides information like the percent of indigenous people nearby, the percent of people that are literate. You can get various poverty proxies, such as the quality of house construction, the age structure of the population, educational level, their access to public services such as lighting, electricity, water, and sewage. And then we also brought in what we call known firm community conflicts. So basically, these were researcher-coded variables from activist websites. But there's basically no other way to get the data. And it's a commonly used technique in what we call political event analysis, is that you essentially look for media reports, or in our case, activist reports of conflicts, and then we identify with like a 1 or a 0 whether there was a conflict reported by activists at that mining property. I should note that that's not we make no judgment as to the accuracy of that information. We simply take the activist reporting as essentially the source of the indicator. And then finally, we developed an indicator for the CSR commitment of the companies. So we basically used CSR reports from head offices in this case, and we coded them according to a 5-point scale that basically went from 1, where there was not much more than a corporate governance statement, to 5, where you had third-party assurance of the quality of CSR programs. Anyway, so we brought all this data together, and we were able to do a statistical analysis with the dependent variable, is to say the outcome being the presence or not of a known conflict as identified by activist organizations. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a little bit of a sort of overview of some of the data. On the left-hand side, you can see a GIS map layer. So each one of those colored dots are a mining property at a different level of development. And then the circles around them are buffers. So at different interval, at 5-kilometer intervals. And so what you can see elsewhere on that map, the brown and the green is basically a different assessment of land color. The pink areas are protected parkland. And so you can see how by drawing those buffers around each property, we're able to get some information about what is the land cover like, or the agriculture, or whether there's an overlap with a protected area. And on the right-hand side, you see the map that we generated, which shows all of the mining properties in the data set, with the stars indicating ones that have a known social conflict.
Dr. Haslam, before going further, there's a question from Ian asking, what do you think of the Responsible Mining Index as a measure of CSR compliance?
Oh, Jan, you're going to have to send me more information about that. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that. So that would probably be a lot.
I will send you the link.
Okay, great. That'd be a lot easier than me going through all those CSR reports. So next slide, please. So in the first work, we looked at what we call the determinants of social conflict in mining. So this study this was published in the journal World Development 3 years ago. So essentially, we looked at 2 big hypotheses that come from the literature, that's from the case study literature, and that's the arguments around socio-environmental causes of conflict, namely that mining can be a threat to can be perceived as a threat to agricultural livelihoods. And secondly, that mining can be associated with conflicts related to distributional concerns, that's to say where local populations protest in order to get more benefits from the firm. We also added an alternative hypothesis, which really hadn't been considered by the literature at that time, or really even today to that extent, which is about whether there are specific characteristics of the firm may be related to conflict independent of other things. And we also tested a number of minor hypotheses like, you know, are juniors more prone to conflict? Are different minerals more prone? Is altitude more, or higher levels of altitude or lower levels of altitude more prone to conflict? Incidentally, we were unable to test institutional hypotheses, which are also important in the literature, because we simply didn't have a highly local variable for institutional quality. We were able to test that at the national level where it didn't really have any effect, but at the local level, we weren't. So what did we find? So looking at our universe as a whole, so this is essentially from 5, so we limited the analysis to 5 countries, so Argentina, Chile, Peru, Mexico, and Brazil. We found 21% of the 640 properties in the data set had a known social conflict. Among the firm level variables that were important, mine type is very important, so that as mine was more likely to be an open pit, there was as opposed to underground or surface mine, there was much more likelihood of conflict. Altitude above 2,500 meters, there was a greater likelihood of conflict. State ownership, this surprised us that if there was any ownership by the state, there was more likely to be conflict. Among the minerals, silver was positively related with conflict. And among firm size, we found that essentially mid-tier producers were more associated with conflict than either juniors or majors. Variables that were associated with less social conflict included local ownership, and among minerals, interestingly, gold, which is certainly not something that the case study literature suggests. So among the socioeconomic or distributive variables, we find that communities where there's a higher level of poverty, that's to say more low quality housing, plus an absence of state services, so like services like provision of sewage is not available, were more likely to be associated with conflict. Communities where there was a larger segment of the population was wealthy, where there was a larger proportion of the population was economically active, that's to say looking for a job, where there's a larger percentage of the population with primary and secondary education were less likely to be associated with conflict. Next slide, please. So among the variables that we call our
Dr. Ashlam,
yes.
My apology, my microphone was mute, so I was talking to myself, but there's a question from Baya. Why mid-tiers are more prone to conflicts than junior or senior?
Why a mid-tier?
Yeah, mid-tiers.
Well, we don't really know why. Our hypothesis is that mid-tiers might have fairly large impacts, but might have lower levels, like less sophisticated CSR or company engagement policies. That's our working hypothesis, but we don't really have evidence one way or the other on that. So merely we've noted this as being something that the analysis produced, but to really definitively know why it would require more research or different research. So in terms of socio-environmental variables, one thing that we find to be very, as agricultural land declines in quality, there is a likelihood of increased conflict. Also, where mines overlap with protected parkland within the buffer, so within a 25-kilometer buffer from the center of the mine, that is also more likely to be associated with conflict. And interestingly, population density, as that increases, is less likely to be associated with social conflict. So if we look at the findings overall, we conclude that as economic opportunities for people become more scarce, the likelihood, especially agricultural opportunities, but more generally, the likelihood of social mobilization increases. So in other words, it's not just competition between mining and other livelihood options that is important, but the intensity of that competition that is important. So poor communities underserved by the state are particularly prone to conflict. National institutional frameworks are not that important as compared to the highly local factors that we indicate above. And some firm level factors are also very important, most notably open pit and local ownership. Next, on the determinants of social conflict more broadly, as a result of that analysis, it became apparent to us that foreign firms were much more likely to be involved in a social conflict than local firms. So we began to follow up on that particular question. So this fits actually quite well with the business literature that already exists called Liability Foreignness, which suggests that foreign firms face, foreign multinationals face discrimination in foreign host country markets due to what that literature calls institutional distance, which you can think of as kind of like the distance between the culture and institutions of the home country of the multinational and the culture and institutions of the host country, right? And it focuses on three elements in particular, three kinds of costs that create this kind of performance liability. So one are social costs related to unfamiliarity with the environment. You don't really know how to run your business in a different host environment. What is called relational disadvantages. So the firm is weakly embedded in local networks to its disadvantage, and also the risk of discriminatory hazards such as government policy, nationalism, anti-imperialist sentiment, which is obviously relevant to the mining industry. So we looked at this question of how place-based characteristics, so many of the variables that we used previously, can interact with foreign ownership to become locational liabilities or that affect firm performance. So these locational liabilities we define as these socio-environmental characteristics of a location that raise the cost of doing business by affecting stakeholder expectations of firm behavior. So this is reflected in the performance cost, the performance cost being the occurrence of social conflict in these cases. So we looked at then how being foreign owned or being locally owned interacted with some of the place-based variables that we used in our earlier study. And we also looked at some of the efforts to mitigate locational liabilities or negative stakeholder perceptions through management learning or CSR practices. So what we found overall is interesting, is that foreign mining firms do experience a performance liability, that's to say defined by greater likelihood of social conflict, as compared to locally owned mining firms. So being foreign is a liability. Being foreign has a cost. When we looked at the interaction between distributional and our livelihoods variables, we found that both foreign and local firms, so we basically split the sample and we interacted the foreign firms and the local firms separately with these other variables. What we found is that basically for both foreign and local firms, a increased scarcity of agricultural livelihoods is associated with conflict. So in a sense, they behave similarly there. But only foreign firms have a problem with overlap with parkland. So so that seems to be a problem for foreign firms, but isn't statistically significant as a cause of conflict or associated with conflict for local firms. And we also think that the data is telling us that distributional pressures, that's pressures to distribute more benefits to communities, we think those are worse for foreign firms, as local firms seem to be able to manage poor communities better, and they also seem to have a better record in terms of less social conflict, managing poor communities with a significant indigenous population. So we also looked at we have these CSR measures that I mentioned. So we did also look at the CSR and the effects and conflict. I have to say that we really weren't able to prove anything in this. Basically, we found that higher levels of CSR were associated with higher levels of conflict, which is obviously counterintuitive. So basically, what we think that's kind of an artifact of the regression analysis that we did. That essentially, because it's not a time, we don't have time series data. So for example, we can't see if, let's say, a conflict later produced better CSR. So what we think probably happening is that conflict, that the order of the variables needs to be reversed in the equation, and that probably social conflict contributes to greater commitment to CSR rather than the other relationship, which doesn't really make sense. Nonetheless, it's also true that it does look like better CSR by foreign firms, because foreign firms are, by our indicator, have much more advanced CSR. Better CSR by foreign firms is not connected to better outcomes in terms of social conflict, right? So this sort of leads us to think that foreign firms may be expected to do better CSR for similar results, or frankly, even worse results as local firms. And this has actually important implications for social license, because I think we provide with this some of the first evidence that the ability to gain and maintain social license to operate may be conditioned by the ownership status of the firm. That's to say, it's harder for foreign firms. And so that argument, we've just, an article has just been accepted that explores those questions in the journal Resources Policy that you might be aware of. Next slide, please. Yeah. So having noticed this performance differential between foreign and local firms, this led us to go one step further and ask whether there were also differences between different nationalities of firms. And so for statistical reasons, we can only split our sample into Canadian and non-Canadian foreign firms, basically because there's a lot of Canadian firms, and the non-Canadian foreign firms are divided among a lot of different nationalities. We don't have enough numbers to assess specific nationalities. Now, as you're probably aware, the case study literature on social conflict between firms and communities has implicated Canadian firms and has argued for the complicity of the Canadian government. I've provided some bibliographic notes there, but you're probably quite aware of them. This has policy implications, obviously, insofar as Canadian firms are believed to perform worse than other nationalities. Generally, the literature suggests that a weak home country legislation, so weak legislation in Canada, often supposed to be weaker than other countries, is hypothesized to be the cause. So this is really the logical argument for enhanced home country oversight. So,
Dr. Haslam,
yep.
there are two questions related to definitions and, well, technical questions. First one is from Jennifer. How were local firms defined? Percentage of ownership. And the other question is from Bayard. What percentage of non-Canadian firms is Chinese? Okay, so
the definition of firm nationality was done by location of headquarters, which is a standard technique in business studies. I mean, there's a debate in Canada about whether firms that access financing on Canadian stock markets are in fact Canadian. That is not so much a problem for us because we just use location of headquarters. And on the other question was on
what percentage of non-Canadian firms is Chinese? And the first one was how were local firms defined it, percentage of ownership, for example.
Yeah, so I say local firms are defined by location of headquarters and not by percentage of ownership. In terms of Chinese firms, so the data, the original set of properties that we bought from Infomine, we got in June 2011. So basically, there are very few Chinese firms in the sample. I know, so essentially the foreign non-Canadian firms that are Chinese firms that, you know, some people have argued have, you know, bad relations with communities, although there's mixed evidence on that, are basically not included in our sample. So we can't assess Chinese firms in our sample.
I have other questions, but I'll keep them for the end because they are discussion kind of questions.
Okay, great.
They are there for discussion.
Yeah, I'm actually almost done anyways.
Okay.
So I do want to spend a couple minute or so on explaining how our research into Canadian firms is different, because this is, you know, well, it has been a controversial topic, and yeah, and obviously it has policy implications. So I think it's important to be careful. So basically, other studies have actually, often studies that you've probably heard about, like EMI's Canada Brand Report, for example, actually use similar sources to us in terms of the data on conflicts, just to say they use data from activist organizations, okay? But those studies are different from ours. What they do, and you know, there was a study, well, there's a number of studies, but you know, there's a study from the Canadian Center for Resource Conflicts, was it? It was, you know, leaked in 2009, actually. Basically, these were all based on counting up problems, right? And not controlling for other possible causes. What we did that's unique is we contextualized the problems of all nationalities, so that when we count up conflicts, but we didn't particularly focus on Canadian firms. We counted based on all firms, right? So we basically, that allows us to contextualize any problems that might be associated with Canadian firms within the larger context of all firms. And we also included, it's very important to note, because this is the basis of our statistical analysis and its real originality, and we also included, obviously, in the sample properties that don't have any conflict. Known conflict associated with them, right? And if, as I mentioned, it's like 21% of the total. So there's like over 500 firms that don't have a conflict associated with them, but they're in the study anyways. So it's having firms with a known conflict and without a known conflict that essentially allows you to say something about conflict. Otherwise, you can't. You're doing something called selecting on the dependent variable, which is highly methodologically suspect when you're just counting up problems, and it really doesn't allow you to explain the reasons for those problems. So that's where we do something unique here. And just to like underline this fact, you know, there was this report from the ESRS-CIM report from 2009, this research paper that was alleged. I mean, I understand it was commissioned by PDAC and then canceled and then leaked, which basically said that 34% of conflicts were associated with Canadian firms, which was 3 times more than the closest peer, Australia. And that statistic has been cited extensively in the literature on Canadian firms. But in fact, on a proportional basis, that study offered weak evidence for Canadian firms behaving worse than others, because it also indicated that 75% of company HQs were in Canada, headquarters. So if you have, you know, 34% of conflict and 75% of companies, essentially that suggests that on a proportional basis, Canadian firms are less involved with conflict. So in fact, our finding is more or less in line with that earlier one, but our methodology is superior. So next slide, please.
Okay, before going to the next slide, I have another question. How many properties were Canadian owned, controlled, and they want a rough percentage? This is a question from Dave.
So in our entire sample, I think it's around 40% were Canadian. Well, when you include local and yeah, local, Canadian, and foreign non-Canadian, I think the Canadian one was around 40%. I don't have the data right in front of me right now, so I'm not 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure it was around 40%. Yeah. Shall I continue?
Yes.
Yeah. So, so do Canadian firms behave worse than firms of other nationalities? Is to say, is Canadianness, so specifically the fact of a headquarter being based in Canada, is that in of itself in controlling for other factors, you know, associated with conflict? And, you know, the literature suggests there's some possible mechanisms for that, such as maybe the home country institutional environment in Canada, you know, a focus on, you know, shareholder self-regulation, limited, what the literature refers to as limited reporting obligations. You know, though that could be a reason. This is the main claim of the literature that styles itself as the sort of imperial Canada tradition. Possible management practices, are CSR practices different in Canada? But you know, alternatively, there could be factors unrelated to nationality could drive conflict, you know, like other firm level factors or other host country factors, and that is obviously a null hypothesis that has to be taken into account. Next slide, please. So what we find is strong evidence, as I mentioned, for a difference between local and foreign firms, right? With the latter, foreign firms being more associated with social conflict defining properties. So when we divide foreign firms into Canadian and foreign non-Canadian firms, we find also a strong basis for differentiation with the former, so Canadian firms being less associated with social conflict than foreign non-Canadian firms, okay? I need to underline that these findings are actually extremely robust across specifications. That's to say, you can run the equations in a whole bunch of different ways, and it comes out basically the same. So that basic fact we have a lot of confidence in. It's harder to explain what accounts for these differences. We think it is that local and Canadian firms seem to do a better job at managing distributive pressures in poor environments than foreign non-Canadian firms. Let's say our level of proof for that is fairly weak, but that's kind of how we think it's going. Next slide, please. So this gives you some, this gives you the details on what we call on the probability of conflict within our data set. So what we find, if you just look at local versus foreign firms, we find that firms with the foreign headquarters have around a 24% chance of being involved in a social conflict, while firms with local headquarters have a 5 to 7% chance of being involved in a conflict. So if we look at local versus Canadian versus foreign non-Canadian firms, you can see how that foreign HQ splits out a little bit. And looking at the left-hand column, we have Canadian firms have a 21% chance of being involved in a social conflict, and foreign non-Canadian firms a 28% chance. Those stars there indicate that it's the highest level of confidence for statistical analysis. So the right-hand columns, I mean, that's basically a robustness check that we did, because we had sort of manipulated the sample a little bit that introduced some bias to it in order to get universal coverage of known social conflicts. So we ran, I mean, this is sort of underlines the robustness of the results. We took out 51 cases of conflict, which is like a huge number, because we only had 128 cases, and those results still stand. So they're extremely robust. I mean, the statistical significance was less, but generally speaking, we find that the very sort of general findings are, we find to be very robust, statistically speaking. Last slide. So the last slide is a bit of a summary. So basically, this like body of work that we've done on this statistical analysis of Canadian firms, basically there's a clear country of origin effect, which is extremely robust. The bottom line is that local firms perform a lot better in terms of being less associated with social conflict than foreign firms. Perhaps they enjoy a legitimacy premium, perhaps fewer locational liabilities. Among foreign firms, Canadian firms perform better than foreign non-Canadian firms. It seems like foreign and local firms perform better in poorer communities. That's to say, we think they manage distributional concerns better, distributional pressures. Social license to operate, we think this shows social license to operate may be much harder to obtain for foreign firms, and that CSR does not fully compensate for liabilities of foreignness. Nonetheless, we also underline that firm level, socio-environmental and distributive concerns remain really important drivers of social conflict, and they're never wiped out by these other ownership variables. And that's it. Happy to take any questions. Edith?
Edith.
Sorry, I was talking to myself again. Sorry about that. I would ask the ones who had questions on the group chat to start maybe, because they had the very relevant questions. So I think I can see Jan. So I won't ask for an order. So you can just jump into the conversation. Jan, unmute yourself.
I forgot to unmute myself. Which one were you referring to again?
I think if I look at your questions on the group chat, you had very heavy questions related to CSR. Maybe you want to start there?
Yeah, okay. I'll first of all, the responsible mining, I'll send you the link.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The mid-tier effect. Could you see how the mid-tier or tier, say it in English, companies fare in CSR? Could you put a link there? Would their CSR performance be linked to their size, or couldn't you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the data, I think that we generally ranked the mid-tiers at a low.
Could you speak up a little louder? I can barely hear you.
Sorry, I'm just wondering if my thing is plugged in here. Yeah, so that we, I think generally the mid-tiers did have a lower level of, I mean, what we recorded as a lower level of CSR. Okay. So, yeah.
So just a comment that you can look at when you get the responsible mining index, you could compare what they have in their database in terms of their evaluation of CSR performance as to what you have. Some people think that their database is lousy, but you could still play around with it.
All right, that's a really good idea. Thanks, John. Yeah, I'll do it.
The other comment that I have, and that's just sort of something I'm not sure about. I've seen in Peru that Volcan Minera, which is a Peruvian firm, committed a number of misdeeds that didn't result in any conflict. And that surprised me an awful lot, because the same conflict, I'm almost dead sure, would have resulted in a big ruckus if it had been a Canadian company. And my assumption here is, and maybe you have a comment on that, that the expectations of foreign firms are much higher. For example, Volcan Minera talks about CSR on its website a bit, but it doesn't nearly create as great expectations as some Canadian companies do, and maybe the expectations are higher. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it could be. I mean, I think the, you know, what I've observed is also that, you know, high expectations, if they're not realized, can really poison the atmosphere around CSR. I would say that what I think probably, I think that like local firms may essentially be able to use what you might call sort of traditional clientelistic practices that end up being effective in containing social mobilization. Maybe partly about expectations. I think is probably partly about their practices that you know, may be effective, but because they're local. they maybe also enjoy greater legitimacy, because any of us who have worked in Latin America, know that there's a strong kind of anti-foreign, anti-imperialist sentiment, and that's something that is frequently, I think, used to encourage people to protest, and maybe it links with makes protest the threshold for protesting just a little bit lower. I mean, that's what I would hypothesize, but I think really it's not something we can really determine from our data.
Right.
Detailed case studies really need to pull that out.
Edit, one commentary for that. Andres here.
Yes,
Edit?
go ahead.
Yes, Jan, you remember Volcan is a Peruvian case. They operated in what Paul mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. They operate in historical mining areas.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference, Jan.
That's right.
But the other thing is Volcan is also family owned. It's not just local, it's family owned. I have seen, being Peruvian and being exposed to these family owned companies, that they are more quick to go to the upfront and resolve any social dispute when it's family owned, because a shareholder is the patriarch of the family. So they have more quick response than a Canadian company that maybe have to go back to headquarters or Lima in order to resolve or propose or find alternative to solve a conflict. That's one aspect of Volcan, in particular in Peru. But my question for Paul, this is incredibly useful for me as a practitioner. One aspect maybe I would like you to consider, not a question, maybe a suggestion, is not only the CSR aspect of a mid-tier company, but also the quality of the management, I would like to say completeness, management efficiency. I have seen in the case, and I can distinguish between nationalities here, the cultural aspects of management, when it's Canadian, it takes longer to be aware of the issues. And that time is something that the local companies, they have in their benefit because they react quickly. But the cultural gaps and the cultural understanding of perceptions and expectation of local stakeholders is something for Canadian mining companies with certain management styles between the different departments of the company takes more risk. Maybe a suggestion for your next round of research about this, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. And I mean, that's, there's some advantages to the kind of research that we've done insofar as you get like the big picture on aggregate, but then the disadvantage is you don't get that kind of fine-grained knowledge about what management is doing and that kind of thing. And it's obviously impossible to come up with indicators for 700 firms on that kind of thing. But yeah, that's the sort of thing that I think case studies to supplement this kind of work could be really, really useful.
Dr. Haslam, I also have Bayar on the group chat with a question. I don't know if Bayar, you want to ask your question and unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to get an overview of Peru and what do you think, and what are the, I guess, risks, if you will, compared to the rest of the Latin America, but particularly on Peru. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's other people who are better suited to answer that question here. I mean, we deliberately actually didn't look at the specific country. I mean, we basically assessed the countries only to see if the national institutions had an important effect, and obviously, Peru has a lot of innovative things such as the canon minero, the decentralization, etc. But we didn't. The only thing we can say is that those sort of national institutional aspects didn't change the fundamental logic of conflict around basically scarcity and competition between scarce agricultural livelihoods and and mining. But I don't really have, I think, the detailed country knowledge to answer your question.
Could I ask a supplemental question to that, or to Bayard? I know that there's a study by Ariano Yanguas who showed that the Canon Minero in Peru was a greater cause of conflict than many other things. And would your study show that? Would that it wouldn't come out of your study somewhere or other, would it?
Well, so yeah, Ariano Yanguas basically was the first to make the argument that a lot of mining conflicts weren't just about the environment, they were about distributional issues. Like the people were angling to get more benefits out of mining. So our study reinforces that finding. We find our proxy for distributional concerns is is statistically significant, and so we find that distributional concerns are frequently, say, across our entire sample, they're statistically significant. Yeah. Although it is interesting, I would say that sort of a little bit more recent work has started to ask whether what Ariano Yanguas observed is affected by institutional quality at the municipal level. And so there's a study by Ponce and McClintock and a study by Orihuela that starts to ask whether that maybe if you look at like institutional quality at the municipal level, you kind of wipe out some of the relationship that Ariano Yanguas finds between the Canon Minero decentralized and conflict.
Which also then we should then also keep in mind that your analysis shows that distributional problems cause conflict, and part of those distributional problems have sometimes nothing to do with the company. They have a lot to do with local governance, with how the Canon Minero is structured and all that sort of stuff. So it's good to keep that in mind before an overall view accuses a company, whereas the company couldn't help but getting caught up in this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the presence of the state is important. We know from the case study literature that conflict is sometimes about drawing the state in, right? And maybe especially in Peru, right? Because, especially in Peru, you had the cabinet level involvement in conflicts and the dialogue tables. So that's definitely important, and it's not really captured by the data I presented today. It's one of the challenges of doing this kind of we constructed this design without being able to take account of local institutional factors, and where like my current work, I'm trying to bring that in, but it turns out to be very difficult to find comparable municipal level institutional indicators you can put into this kind of study.
That would be fascinating if you could get that in there, but that would be a big task.
Yeah. Dr. Haslam, I have other questions here from Dave Jakelski and David Clary as well, and I have one for myself that I will keep for the end. So maybe Dave Jakelski, sorry if I pronounce your name in the wrong way.
Yes, so on effective livelihood offset programs, I'm afraid I don't know enough about that to really comment. I'd certainly be interested in learning more. If you have any information, you can send me about that. From Dave Clary's comment, asking if we have further intention to work on in this area. Yeah, so basically we do. As I mentioned, the original set of data, so the list of properties we bought in 2011, and most of the building of the data set occurred to the end of 2013. So that information is getting out of date already. So my current project is is to kind of rebuild the database, but with two main big differences. One is to add a time dimension. So to basically get a line of data for every property for 15 years. And then additionally to find proxies for local institutional quality, maybe municipal spending, something that we can use that's comparable across different countries. So both of those are pending tasks. They're on my agenda for this summer to start them, but they're also difficult to they're difficult to realize. But basically, if we have a time dimension, we'll be able to make much more accurate conclusions about, like, how does CSR play in these conflicts? Does it occur before a conflict or after a conflict? Institutional change, how does that affect conflicts? So we'll be able to, I think, sort of increase the sophistication of the analysis quite significantly if we can do that to the data set.
Thank you. There's another question from Will Merrick, so I will leave, that will be the last question for this webinar, and that will be the one from Will Merrick.
Yeah, so the question of how did we determine whether a property was associated with a known social conflict? So it was really very simple. So we generated our list of properties independently, like it came from InfoMine, right? So it was as close to universal as we would expect. So for the conflicts, it basically, often these things aren't even reflected in national print media. So, you can't really do it through media sources either. So we basically turned to a couple of activist organizations that publicize this information on their website. So the main one being ALCA, the Observatorio Latinoamericano de Conflictos Ambientales, based in Santiago. And we basically kind of mined their website for data. And then we cross-referenced that with publications on another activist website called Minds and Communities. And then for the Peruvian case, we used information from the Defensoría del Pueblo. And so that combination of data allowed us to basically, to check off, was there a claimed social conflict at a site or was there not? And we didn't try to sort of verify it. We just used that information.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all of you to attend this Environmental and Social Responsibility Society. And just to remember, all of you, that we have a working group on conflict in Latin America. So if you're interested, I will ask you to send an email to Andres Recalde or to who's the lead of this working group, or to ESRS mail address. And again, thank you, Dr. Ashlam, for your presentation.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And can't wait to read you again with the second study related to that. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, bye, Jan. Thanks.